Chapter 17, Difficult and Dangerous Work. Joe's old car labored and coughed and wheezed, crawling up the long, steep ascent to Blewett Pass, high in the Cascade Mountains. That morning, in June of 1935, he had thrown his banjo and his clothes in the back seat, said goodbye to Joyce for the summer, and driven out of Seattle, heading east looking for work. Jobs were still scarce, but there was hope for Joe. The previous summer, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had traveled out to Washington to a town near the Columbia River in a 50-mile-long dry canyon called the Grand Coulee. 20,000 people gathered to hear him speak, among them George Pocock and his family. When President Roosevelt appeared on the platform before them, the crowd roared its welcome, and when he spoke of plans to build a massive new dam in that rough, empty country, they cheered again. The Grand Coulee Dam, he said, would bring water to arid farmland, generate electrical power, and create thousands of jobs. Now, less than a year after Roosevelt's speech, Joe drove down from the mountains, through gently rolling jade-green wheat fields, into the rugged Washington Scablands, then onto the ramshackle boomtown of Grand Coulee, perched just above the Columbia River. 30 minutes after he stepped out of his car, he had a job. To build the foundation of the dam, hundreds of workers first had to knock away layers of loose rock from the canyon walls to get to the older granite bedrock. Then the granite itself had to be shaped. The men who performed this work had to strap themselves into harnesses, dangle from the cliff face hundreds of feet above the river, and pound away at the rock with jackhammers. The work was difficult and dangerous, but it paid better than the other jobs at the dam. Joe signed himself up for 75 cents an hour. That evening, before his first day of work, he sat on the hood of his car in front of the office. Down in the coulee, steam shovels and electric shovels clawed at piles of loose rock. Bulldozers pushed earth and rocks from one place to another. Tractors crawled back and forth, gouging out terraces. On the cliffs, men suspended from ropes crawled and swung from one spot to another like so many black spiders. Studying them, Joe saw that they were drilling holes in the rock faces with jackhammers. As he watched, a long shrill whistle blew, and the jackhammer men scrambled quickly to the tops of their lines. At the base of the cliffs, hundreds of men who'd been loosening the fallen rock with picks and crowbars suddenly scurried away. The deep, hollow, concussive sound of an explosion boomed and blossomed across the canyon. A shower of rocks and boulders tumbled down on the piles below. Joe was not at all sure what he was getting into here, but he was flat broke again and more than a little discouraged. Not just about the money, but about the whole crew business. Demoted and promoted and demoted again, he'd started to think of himself as a kind of yo-yo in the hands of the coaches, and yet the notion of the Olympic gold had just begun to work its way into his brain. A medal would be real and solid. It would be forever, something nobody could deny or take away. He wanted that gold medal now, and it surprised him how much it had begun to mean to him. He figured it had something to do with Thula, or with his father. Certainly it had something to do with Joyce. He felt more and more that he had to get to Berlin to prove something to himself and to his family. To do that, he had to make the first varsity boat. And to do that, he had to pay for another year of school. That meant strapping on a harness, grabbing a jackhammer, and lowering himself over the edge of a cliff in the morning. The jackhammer work was brutal. For 8 hours a day, he dangled on a rope in the furnace-like heat of the canyon, pounding at the wall of rock in front of him. The jackhammer was heavy and seemed to have a life of its own, constantly trying to rip itself out of his grip. Rock, dust, gritty and irritating, swirled around him. It got in his eyes, his mouth, and his nose. Sharp chips and the shards of rocks flew up and stung his face. Sweat dripped from his back and fell away into the void below. He learned to cooperate closely with the men dangling on either side of him. They worked together, keeping an eye out for rocks falling from above, dodging them when they did, calling out warnings to those below, searching for better places to find seams in the rock. By the end of each day, he was exhausted, parched with thirst, and ravenously hungry. 3 times a day he ate in the mess hall, sitting shoulder to shoulder with men at long tables. He ate as he had back in his boyhood at the gold and ruby mine, tucking into mountains of food. Eggs, pancakes, bacon, and sausage at breakfast, then sandwiches and ice cream for lunch. Finally, a huge meal of red meat or chicken at dinner, topped off with slabs of pie. Joe never left a scrap on his plate or anyone else's within reach. Each night he climbed up to the hill to to a place called Shacktown, where he had found a cheap room to rent in a long, rickety, shed-like building. The building had no indoor plumbing and only enough electricity to supply one bare light bulb that hung overhead. Each of the gravel streets in Shacktown had a shower house, but Joe soon found that taking a shower was not a comfortable experience. Hordes of black widow spiders lurked in the rafters above the showers, and they tended to drop on the men below as soon as the water turned on. After watching a few of its neighbors leap out of the shower, yelping and battling at themselves, Joe finally took to carrying a broom into the shower each evening to clear the rafters of eight-legged invaders before he turned the water on. For the first couple of weeks, Joe kept mostly to himself after work and dinner, sitting in the dark playing his banjo. Then he discovered that there were two boys from the Washington Shell House working at the dam as well. He did not know either of them very well, but that was about to change. Johnny White had sat in the number 2 seat in Coach Bull's outstanding freshman boat. He was an inch shorter than Joe and more slightly built with all-American good looks. He was also nearly as poor as Joe Rance. He graduated from high school at 16, then spent the next 2 years working in a shipyard and a sawmill, saving cash and building brawn. Now he'd arrived at Grand Coulee looking to make more money and build more muscle. The other Washington boy at Grand Coulee was Chuck Day. He was pure muscle, broad in the shoulders, and his eyes could be cheerful one moment, flashing with rage the next. He wore glasses but managed to look tough doing it, and despite Ulbrichtsen's rules, he almost always had a cigarette dangling from his lips. The previous year he had rowed in Bobby Moush's boat. He and Joe had hardly ever exchanged 2 words, at least not civil words. Now, though, the 3 boys fell into an easy and comfortable friendship. Without a word, they put aside the rivalries of the Shell House, forgot about the insults. After their long, crushingly hard work weeks, they gathered on Saturday afternoons to escape the heat and watch movies at the Grand Coulee Theater. At night, they wandered Beach Street, a 3-block stretch of dirt and gravel lined on either side with the card rooms and bars and pool halls and Fleabag hotels and a Chinese restaurant, the Woo Dip Kitchen. Jazz and country music poured out of the bars and dance halls. The boys took it all with wide eyes. None of them had ever seen anything quite like it, and they weren't sure how to behave in this new world. They remembered Al Ulbrichtsen's rules: no smoking, no drinking, no cussing, but there were many temptations. They drank some beer and played some pool and sang along with ragtag cowboys bands late into the night. When they wanted to escape the noise of Beach Street, the boys sometimes traveled down the Coulee to swim in Soap Lake. For the most part, though, they stayed in Grand Coulee, where they could toss a football around, hurl rocks off the edges of the cliffs, or sit around a campfire at night telling ghost stories as coyotes yelped into the distance. They were happy, free, and easy, cut loose in the wild expanse of the western desert, ignoring for now the contest that they all knew lay ahead the following year.